Settle in, and let us tell you the story of a woman who was 51 years old, alone, and down to $11.40 when her own husband's brother put her belongings on the porch and told her the farm was no longer hers to stand on. His name was Silas Coldwell, and he said the debts their family owed made the decision for him, though anyone in Larkspur Hollow, Nebraska, could have told you Silas had wanted that land since the day his brother married it out from under him. With what little she had folded into a handkerchief and sewn into her coat lining, she walked 3 miles into town and, at a courthouse auction nobody else wanted to attend, bought the burned-out remains of the old Whitcombe homestead for $8, a place so ruined and so long whispered about that even the auctioneer laughed as he took her money. It was, by every measure the town understood, a fool's purchase. But sealed beneath that scorched earth was something that had waited 11 years to be found, something that would not only change the shape of her life, but quietly set right a wrong that had bent an entire community out of true. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Vance. If you are watching this from a place that others have written off as ruined, forgotten, or not worth the trouble, tell us in the comments. We would love to know. Eleanor had not always been a Coldwell. She was born Eleanor Marsh in 1836, in a cabin at the edge of a Missouri River town. The third of 6 children to a father who mended harness leather and a mother who kept the family fed on a garden the size of a quilt. What the Marsh family lacked in money, they made up for in a particular kind of stubbornness that Eleanor's mother called seeing what's still good in a busted thing. It was not a saying so much as a way of living. Eleanor's mother could take a torn dress, a cracked churn, a chair with a broken leg, and find in it the shape of something still useful, still worth the mending. She taught her daughters to sew not just clothing but quilts from scraps too small for anyone else to bother with, and she taught them, too, that a person's worth was never fixed by what state you found them in, only by what they still had left to give. Eleanor's father, for his part, taught her to read a ledger, to keep accounts, to understand that numbers on a page could tell the truth even when people would not. He kept the harness shop's books himself, and some evenings, when the younger children were asleep, he let Eleanor sit beside him with her own small tablet, teaching her sums and the discipline of writing things down correctly, in order, without embellishment. A true account, he told her once, is worth more than gold, because gold can be stolen, but the truth, once it's written plain, is hard to kill. She did not know, as a girl of 12, how much she would come to need those words. At 19, Eleanor married Thomas Vance, a quiet, careful man with sun-browned hands and a laugh that came slow but came honest. Thomas had claimed 160 acres in the Nebraska Territory under the promise of the new Homestead laws. Out past a spring-fed creek the local Pawnee and early settlers alike had called Larkspur Hollow for the wildflowers that bloomed there each May. It was hard land, but Thomas was a hard worker, and Eleanor brought to their marriage the same eye her mother had given her, the eye that looked at a wind-broken fence, a half-collapsed barn, a field gone fallow, and saw not what was lost but what could still be salvaged. Together they built a modest but sturdy life. They raised 2 children, a son named Caleb and a daughter named Ruth, both of whom grew up strong on that land and both of whom, by the terrible arithmetic of frontier life, did not survive to adulthood. Caleb lost to a fever the winter he turned 9, Ruth to a wagon accident on the Larkspur Road when she was 14. Eleanor grieved in the only way she knew how to survive grief, by working. She kept the garden, she kept the books for the farm exactly as her father had taught her, she mended what broke and made do with what remained. And she and Thomas leaned on each other through losses that would have broken lesser partnerships. It was Thomas's younger brother, Silas, who had always resented the way things had settled. Their father had left the family's modest savings and a small parcel of land to be divided, and though it had been divided fairly, Silas had always believed, loudly, at Christmas dinners and church socials alike, that Thomas had gotten the better portion, the better wife, the better luck. Silas himself had drifted between failed ventures, a dry goods store that folded within 2 years, a cattle scheme that lost money 3 seasons running, and finally a partnership with Josiah Pruitt, the town's banker, in a series of land deals that most folks in Larkspur Hollow did not fully understand but that seemed, somehow, to always leave Silas a little richer and his neighbors a little more indebted to the bank. Eleanor had never trusted Silas, not since she was a young bride and caught him quietly asking Thomas what the Vance acreage might be worth if it ever came up for sale. But Thomas had loved his brother with the blind loyalty of a man who remembered him as a boy before he remembered him as he'd become, and Eleanor had held her tongue for the sake of peace. For 26 years, right up until the winter, Thomas caught pneumonia hauling feed through a blizzard and did not recover. The fall came quickly after that, the way a fence post rots quietly for years and then simply gives way one ordinary afternoon. Thomas had, without Eleanor's full knowledge, co-signed 2 notes with Silas at Pruitt's bank. Notes meant, Silas claimed, to shore up a cattle venture that would benefit them both. Eleanor had seen the papers only once, in passing, and Thomas had waved off her concern with the easy confidence of a man who trusted his brother more than he trusted his own instincts. When Thomas died, those notes came due, and Silas, who had, it turned out, quietly transferred his own share of liability into Thomas's name through a set of documents Eleanor would only later understand, stood in her kitchen with Josiah Pruitt's clerk and a folder of papers and explained, with what he must have believed was genuine regret, that the debts now belonged to the estate, and the estate was the farm, and the farm, regrettably, would need to be sold to satisfy the bank. Eleanor asked to see the original notes. Silas said the originals were with the bank. She asked to speak with Pruitt directly. Pruitt was, she was told, unavailable, and would remain unavailable for every week she tried for the following 2 months. She had no lawyer, no money for one, and no family left to stand behind her, her own parents long dead, her siblings scattered across 3 states, her children in the ground beside their father. The court, such as it was in that corner of the territory, sided with the paperwork, because paperwork was what the court understood. And Eleanor's understanding of what had truly happened counted for nothing against a signature that was, technically, her late husband's own hand. She was given 11 days to vacate. Silas came himself to see it done, standing on the porch of the home she had scrubbed and mended and loved for 26 years, arms crossed, telling her this was simply how debts worked and he was sorry it had come to this. Though his eyes did not carry sorrow so much as the flat satisfaction of a man finally collecting on an old grudge he had never spoken aloud. Eleanor did not argue. She had learned, somewhere in the long years of losing a son and then a daughter and then a husband, that arguing with people who had already decided your fate rarely changed the outcome. Only spent strength she could not afford to lose. She packed what she could carry, sold what furniture she could not, and walked into Larkspur Hollow with $11.40 sewn into her coat, a Bible that had been her mother's, and a small tin box of sewing notions that had survived 3 moves and 2 decades. She was 51 years old, a widow twice bereaved of her children, and she did not know, standing on the boardwalk outside the courthouse that gray October morning in 1887, where she would sleep come nightfall. It was pure chance, or something that only later would look like more than chance, that brought her to the courthouse steps that same morning, where the county was auctioning off a handful of abandoned and tax-forfeited properties to recoup unpaid levies. Most of the parcels drew no interest at all, burned foundations, flooded bottomland, claims too far from water to farm. But one property drew a peculiar kind of attention, not because anyone wanted it, but because everyone in town seemed to have an opinion about why no one should. It was the old Whitcombe place, 3 miles north along the creek, 110 acres that had once belonged to Elias Whitcombe, one of the earliest settlers in the hollow and, by most accounts, the man who had helped survey and name half the valley. Whitcombe had vanished without explanation in the spring of 1876, 11 years before, leaving behind a burned-out cabin, an untended orchard gone to bramble, and a reputation among the townsfolk that ranged from cursed to haunted to, more practically, not worth the trouble of clearing. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Otis Grigg, who Eleanor had known for years, read out the parcel almost as an afterthought, joking that he'd knock a nickel off for anyone brave enough to spend a night there. The crowd laughed. Nobody raised a hand. And Eleanor Vance, standing at the back with everything she owned in a carpet bag and $11.40 to her name, found herself stepping forward and offering $8 for the whole ruined 110 acres. The laughter that followed was not cruel exactly, but it was not kind either. Someone called out that she bought herself a graveyard. Someone else asked if she planned to farm ghosts. Silas himself, who had come to town that day to finalize the sale of the Vance farm to a buyer Pruitt's bank had already lined up, turned from across the square and watched with an expression Eleanor would remember for years afterward, not concern, not even curiosity, but a kind of dismissive amusement. The look of a man watching a stray dog chase its own tail. Eleanor paid her $8 to the county clerk, received a deed with trembling hands, and walked the 3 miles north along Larkspur Creek with the last of her money and the last of her pride. Telling herself, with the same stubborn practicality her mother had taught her decades before, that a ruined thing was still a thing, and a thing was still more than nothing. The Whitcombe place, when she reached it in the fading light of that October afternoon, was worse and somehow better than she had expected. The cabin itself was little more than a blackened shell, its roof long collapsed, its front wall standing like a broken tooth against the sky. But the land around it told a different story to Eleanor's practiced eye, an old stone well still capped and sound, a root cellar door half buried under 11 years of leaf litter but intact. Fruit trees in the overgrown orchard that, beneath their neglect, still showed the careful pruning scars of a man who had once known what he was doing. She spent that first night in the root cellar itself, the only structure with a roof still whole, wrapped in her coat with her mother's Bible for a pillow. And she did not sleep so much as endure the hours, listening to the wind move through the broken cabin above and telling herself that tomorrow, in daylight, things would look less impossible. They did, a little. In the gray dawn she explored the cellar properly for the first time, and it was there, running her hand along the earthen wall to steady herself on the uneven floor, that her fingers caught on something that did not belong, a seam in the packed dirt too straight, too deliberate, to be natural. Running along the base of the north wall where the shelving had once stood. She spent the better part of that first full day clearing debris from the cabin's collapsed section, salvaging what boards and nails she could, and it was not until the second evening, working by lamplight in the cellar with a trowel she'd found rusted but usable among the ruins, that she uncovered what that seemed concealed, a second, smaller door, no more than 3 feet high. Built directly into the cellar wall itself and sealed with clay that had hardened over more than a decade into something nearly as solid as stone. It took her the better part of an hour to work the clay loose, her fingers raw and bleeding by the time the door gave way with a groan of old hinges, revealing not another cellar, as she had half expected, but a narrow earthen passage sloping downward into the dark, shored up with timber the way a man might shore up a mine. She did not go further that first night. She sat back on her heels in the lamplight, staring into that black opening, and felt for the first time since Thomas's death something other than grief or exhaustion, a small, careful flicker of curiosity, the kind her mother would have recognized instantly, the kind that asks, what is still good in this busted thing? What follows next, we promise, will not disappoint you. It took Eleanor 3 more days to gather the courage and the means to explore the passage fully, 3 days spent making the cellar and the one intact room of the cabin livable. Patching what she could with salvaged boards and old canvas, trading a length of her precious sewing thread with a passing peddler for a stub of candles and a tin of matches. When she finally descended into the passage with a lit lantern in one hand and her father's old trowel in the other, she found it ran perhaps 40 feet into the hillside before opening into a small chamber, dry and cool and clearly dug and shored with real purpose rather than desperation. And there, in that chamber, she found what Elias Whitcombe had spent the last months of his life hiding. It was not gold, though there was some of that too, wrapped in oilcloth in an amount that made Eleanor's breath catch, perhaps $300 in coin. A fortune to a woman who had arrived with 11. But the coin was the least of it. What mattered, what would come to matter more than Eleanor could have imagined that first night, was a wooden strongbox containing a thick sheaf of documents, surveyor's notes. Hand-drawn maps of the entire Larkspur Hollow Valley marked with boundary lines and creek courses, and a leather-bound ledger filled with Elias Whitcombe's own careful, cramped handwriting. Dated across the years from 1868 through the spring of 1876. Eleanor sat on the cold earthen floor of that hidden chamber and read by lantern light until the candle guttered low. And what she read reshaped everything she thought she understood about the valley she had lived in for a quarter of a century. Elias Whitcombe, it turned out, had not simply been one of the valley's earliest settlers, he had been the man the territorial government had commissioned to conduct the original land survey of Larkspur Hollow, back in 1868. Before the Homestead claims were formally opened. His ledger recorded, in painstaking and damning detail, how a young banker newly arrived from the east, a man named Josiah Pruitt. The very man who now ran Larkspur Hollow's only bank, had bribed Whitcombe's assistant surveyor to alter key boundary markers before the official claims were filed. Shifting the richest bottomland and the most reliable water rights along the creek away from the homesteaders who would settle there and into a set of reserved parcels that Pruitt then quietly acquired through the Territorial Land Office over the following several years, using a chain of paper transactions designed to obscure his involvement. Whitcombe had discovered the fraud only after the fact, when he returned to correct an error in his own final survey and found the original field notes did not match the filed claims. He had spent years afterward quietly gathering proof, the true survey markers, witness statements from the assistant surveyor before the man died of consumption in 1874. Correspondence that implicated Pruitt directly, intending, his ledger made clear, to bring the matter before the territorial court and see the rightful boundaries restored to the families who had built their lives believing the land beneath them was fairly theirs. But the ledger's final entries, dated the week before Whitcombe's disappearance in the spring of 1876, grew increasingly urgent and afraid. He wrote of being followed. He wrote of a visit from Pruitt himself, polite on its surface, carrying an unmistakable threat beneath the courtesy. He wrote that he intended to travel to the territorial capital to file his evidence formally, and that if anything should happen to him before he could, he was leaving his proof buried where only a patient hand, and not a greedy one, would think to look. He never made that journey. He was never seen again, and the town, over the following years, had simply absorbed his disappearance into legend. The way small towns absorb inconvenient mysteries, turning a man who had tried to do right by his neighbors into a ghost story told to frighten children away from an empty homestead. Eleanor sat with that knowledge for a long while, the lantern burning lower, understanding with a growing and uncomfortable clarity what it meant that she, of all people, penniless and cast out by her own family, had stumbled into proof that could unmake the fortune and the standing of Josiah Pruitt, the very banker whose institution had, through instruments she still did not fully understand, taken her own farm from her not 2 weeks before. She understood, too, with the same clarity, that this knowledge was not truly hers alone to use as she pleased. It belonged, in the deepest sense, to every family in Larkspur Hollow who had spent 19 years farming land whose boundaries had been quietly stolen from them before they ever arrived, paying taxes and water fees and mortgage interest on an unfairness they'd never had the chance to see. She did not act rashly. She had learned enough, in a life spent watching men like Silas move quickly and carelessly, to know that proof without preparation could be buried again, this time for good, if it fell into the wrong hands or was presented in the wrong way. She spent the following weeks doing what her father had taught her to do best. She made a true account. She copied Whitcombe's ledger entries in her own hand, preserving the originals in a dry, hidden place separate from the copies. She cross-referenced his survey maps against the current county land records, which she was able to view at the courthouse under the guise of researching her own new deed, a request no clerk thought twice about, since everyone assumed the widow Vance was simply trying to understand what fool's bargain she'd bought herself. She began, quietly and carefully, speaking with a handful of the valley's older families, the Hollisters, the Dunmores, the widow Prieger, asking gentle questions about the earliest years of their claims, about water disputes that had never quite made sense to them. About parcels of good bottomland that had somehow always belonged to the bank rather than to any homesteader. Piece by piece, without ever revealing what she carried, she confirmed what Whitcombe's ledger had already told her: an entire community had been quietly shorted for 19 years. And had never known enough to even ask the right question. It did not take long for word to spread that the widow Vance had bought the cursed Whitcombe place and was, strangely, not just surviving out there but asking questions around town. Silas heard of it within a month, and he did not like it. He rode out to the homestead himself one gray November afternoon, ostensibly to see how she was faring. Though Eleanor understood within the first minute of his visit that he had come to assess whether she posed him any danger. He walked the ruined property with an appraiser's eye, remarked with poorly concealed disdain on the state of the cabin, and asked, too casually, whether she'd found anything of interest in her digging around. Eleanor, who had spent 26 years learning to read her brother-in-law's tells, told him only that she'd found an old well and a decent orchard and was grateful for the roof over her head, however patched. Silas did not entirely believe her. She could see that in the way his eyes lingered a beat too long on the cellar door, but he left without pressing further. And Eleanor understood that she was now working against time, not just against ignorance. Josiah Pruitt himself came a week later, and his visit was considerably less casual. He arrived in a fine buggy with his clerk beside him, dressed for a Sunday he had not attended, and he made a show of concern for Eleanor's welfare that fooled no one, least of all Eleanor. He offered, with the smooth cadence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, to purchase the Whitcombe property from her outright, a generous sum, he called it. Far more than the $8 she'd paid, more money than she'd ever held in her life, enough to buy a comfortable house in town and never think of ruined homesteads again. Eleanor understood immediately what the offer truly was, not generosity, but fear wearing generosity's clothes. She thanked him for his kindness and told him she needed time to consider it. Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating, and Eleanor knew, watching his buggy roll back down the frozen road, that she had perhaps a matter of weeks, not months, before he stopped asking politely and started taking the way Silas had taken her farm, through paper, through debt. Through whatever quiet instrument a banker could invent to strip a stubborn widow of 110 acres she'd bought for $8 and a prayer. She could have run. She could have taken the coin from Whitcombe's chamber, left the valley entirely, and built some small, safe, anonymous life elsewhere with more money than she'd had in years. The thought crossed her mind more than once during the cold, uncertain nights that followed Pruitt's visit. When the wind found every gap in the cabin's patched walls and she lay awake calculating just how far $300 might carry a woman with nothing left to lose. But each time the thought surfaced, she found herself remembering her mother's hands working a torn quilt back into something whole, and her father's voice telling her that a true account, once written plain, was hard to kill, and she understood, with the same stubborn clarity that had carried her through every loss of her life. That running would mean the truth died with Elias Whitcombe's memory, buried a second time, this time by her own hand instead of his enemies. So instead, Eleanor did what she had always done with broken things. She began, carefully and deliberately, to put them back together. She traveled by wagon to the territorial capital herself, a journey of nearly 4 days that she made alone with her copied ledger pages and survey maps wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. And she sought out the territorial land office directly, presenting herself not as a grieving widow with a grievance, but as the current legal owner of the original Whitcombe survey records. A matter of historical land documentation she wished to have formally reviewed and entered into the county record. The clerk who received her, a careful young man named Mr. Aldous Fenn, who had only recently taken his post and had no particular loyalty to Pruitt or to anyone else in Larkspur Hollow, found the documents compelling enough to forward them, along with Eleanor's sworn affidavit, to the Territorial Surveyor General for formal review, a process, he warned her honestly, that could take months and offered no guarantee of outcome. Eleanor thanked him and told him, with a steadiness that surprised even her, that she had already waited 11 years without knowing it, and she could wait a few months more, now that she did. She She returned to Larkspur Hollow to find that word of her journey had traveled faster than she had, distorted and half-formed the way rumors travel in small towns. And Silas was waiting for her on the road into the valley with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the flat satisfaction of a man who had already won, but the tight, brittle look of a man who feared he might be about to lose everything he'd spent a decade building. He told her, without preamble, that she was making a grave mistake, that whatever she thought she'd found in that cellar was worthless without proper authority behind it. That she would only bring trouble down on herself and anyone foolish enough to stand with her. Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime being told by men in her family what she should and shouldn't do, looked her brother-in-law steadily in the eye and told him that she had already sent copies of Elias Whitcombe's ledger, the parts naming his own dealings with Josiah Pruitt on the notes that had taken the Vance farm, to the Territorial Surveyor General along with everything else. And that whatever happened next was no longer in anyone's hands but the law's. It was, in truth, only partly a bluff. She had sent the survey documents in full, but had held back the specific pages implicating Silas's more recent dealings, hoping to give him a chance to make things right rather than to destroy him outright, for even now, even after everything, she found she could not quite bring herself to want her husband's brother ruined, only honest. But Silas did not know that, and the fear in his face told her the bluff, or the near truth, had landed exactly as she'd hoped. The Territorial Review took the better part of the following spring, and Larkspur Hollow spent those months in a state of low, simmering agitation. As word spread through the valley that the old Whitcombe survey was under formal challenge and that the boundaries so many families had farmed for 19 years might not, after all, be the boundaries the law would recognize, Josiah Pruitt did not go quietly. He engaged what lawyers he could afford, argued that Whitcombe's ledger was the unreliable record of a man who had vanished under suspicious circumstances and could not be trusted. And for a time it seemed the whole matter might dissolve into exactly the kind of paperwork tangle that had cost Eleanor her own farm the year before. But this time, Eleanor was not alone. The families she had quietly spoken with that first winter, the Hollisters, the Dunmores, the widow Prieger, and eventually more than a dozen others who came forward once they understood what was truly at stake, added their own recollections. Their own long-nursed suspicions about water rights and boundary lines that had never quite made sense, until the weight of a community's memory, backed by Whitcombe's original field notes and the dead assistant surveyor's own witness statement, proved more than Pruitt's lawyers could hold back. In June of 1888, the Territorial Surveyor General issued a formal ruling restoring the original Whitcombe survey as the legal boundary record for Larkspur Hollow, invalidating nearly 2 decades of fraudulently altered claims and returning disputed bottomland and water rights to 11 families who had farmed adjacent to lines that had, all along, been drawn a little too conveniently in the bank's favor. Josiah Pruitt's reputation did not survive the revelation intact. A formal inquiry into his conduct followed. And though the passage of years and the limits of frontier law meant he was never made to answer for Elias Whitcombe's disappearance itself, he lost his position at the bank, lost the trust of nearly every family in the valley, and left Larkspur Hollow within the year, a quiet exile that felt, to those who had suffered under his schemes, like justice enough. Silas Coldwell, faced with the pages Eleanor had held back and the very real threat of prosecution for his part in the falsified notes that had taken the Vance farm, chose instead to make restitution, transferring what remained of his interest in the old Vance acreage back to Eleanor's name and leaving Larkspur Hollow for good, a small and imperfect justice. But a justice nonetheless, one that Eleanor accepted not with triumph but with the tired relief of a woman who had simply wanted, at long last, to be told the truth plainly. We began this story by telling you that Eleanor Vance was 51 years old, penniless, and cast out, and that she spent $8 on a ruined homestead everyone else had laughed at. We told you that what she found underground would change not only her life but restore something to an entire community, and now you understand what that meant. She did not use Elias Whitcombe's coin to build herself a grand house or to leave the valley for somewhere easier. She used a portion of it to properly rebuild the Whitcombe homestead as her own true home, restored the little orchard until it bore fruit again, and gave the greater share of it Along with the restored land itself, toward rebuilding what Pruitt's schemes had quietly worn down for 19 years, a proper schoolhouse for the valley's children. A shared well and irrigation channel for the families whose water rights had finally been made right, and a small stone marker at the edge of Larkspur Creek bearing Elias Whitcombe's name. So that the man who had died trying to tell the truth would not be remembered as a ghost story any longer, but as what he actually was, a man who saw what was wrong and tried, at the cost of his own life, to set it right. Eleanor understood, better than most, what it meant to be written off as ruined and worthless by people who had never bothered to look closely. She had spent her whole life being taught, first by her mother's hands and then by her own long grief, that a busted thing was rarely as busted as it looked. If only someone patient enough was willing to dig. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Eleanor Vance. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more worth than the world gives them credit for. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that others had already written off? Until next time, stay close.